Welcome everyone. Today we're going to explore Mega Goal 2.1, focusing on TV around the world. This is Unit 4, and we'll also be looking at some important grammar points related to the topic. Over the next few slides, I'll guide you through different aspects of television in various countries and how we can talk about it effectively. So let's get started and enjoy the journey through TV around the world. Today, we're going to differentiate between the direct object and the indirect object in a sentence. First, let's clarify what each one is. The direct object is the thing that receives the action directly, while the indirect object is the person or thing that benefits from or is affected by that action. To help understand this better, let's look at how we can rearrange words to identify these objects clearly. For example, if I say, "Give the book to Sarah," we can rearrange it to "give Sarah the book." Here, the book is the direct object because it's what is being given, and Sarah is the indirect object because she is the recipient. Another example might be, "Send him a letter." We can think of it as "send a letter to him." The letter is the direct object, and him is the indirect object. It's important to apply these rules carefully when doing exercises. Correct identification of direct and indirect objects will help you understand sentence structure better and improve your grammar skills. So, remember, look for the action first, then find who or what is directly receiving it, and who or what is indirectly involved. Now let's look at what a direct object is and who or what it involves. A direct object is essentially a noun or a pronoun that receives the action of a verb. It's the part of the sentence that answers the question, what or whom, after the verb. For example, in the sentence, "Sami sold the car," the word car is the direct object because it's what Sami sold. When we break down this sentence, we have a subject, Sami, who performs the action. The verb is sold, which is in the past tense here. And then the direct object, which is the car, is what receives that action. Understanding the concept of a direct object helps us see how sentences are structured. Who is doing what to whom? It's a key part of making our sentences clear and complete, especially as we look at how different parts of a sentence work together to convey meaning. Let's take a closer look at how indirect objects function in a sentence. For there to be an indirect object, there must first be a direct object present. The indirect object is the recipient of the action, telling us to whom or for whom something is done. In our example, Sami sold the car to Ali. Here, the car is the direct object, what is being sold, and to Ali indicates the indirect object, the person receiving the action. Notice how the structure clearly shows that Sami is the subject, sold is the verb, the car is the direct object, and to Ali points to the indirect object. Understanding this relationship helps us grasp the overall sentence structure and how actions are directed toward different entities. It's a key concept in clearly communicating who is doing what to whom. All right, let's dive into this slide. So when there's no preposition in a sentence, the indirect object comes before the direct object. For example, in the sentence, "Sarah gave her teacher flowers," we see that her teacher is the indirect object and flowers is the direct object. Here, since there's no preposition, the indirect object naturally goes before the direct object. Now, things change a bit when there's a preposition involved. In that case, the indirect object moves after the direct object. For instance, in "Sarah gave flowers to her teacher," you can see that flowers is still the direct object, but to her teacher is the prepositional phrase indicating the indirect object. Notice how the indirect object, her teacher, now comes after the direct object, following the preposition. The key point to remember here is that the position of the indirect object depends on whether a preposition is used. Without a preposition, it comes before the direct object. With a preposition, it goes after the direct object. This helps us understand sentence structure better and makes our communication clearer. This concept fits into our overall theme of understanding sentence structure, especially how different elements like objects and prepositions interact to form clear, correct sentences. Now, let's look at some examples to understand direct and indirect objects better. In these sentences, the direct object is the thing that receives the action directly, while the indirect object is the person or thing that benefits from or is affected by that action. For instance, in the sentence, "She charged the phone for me," the phone is the direct object because it's what's being charged. The phrase "for me" indicates the indirect object, showing who benefits from the action. Similarly, "They gave a gift to their mother." Here, the gift is the direct object, and the mother is the indirect object because she's the recipient of the gift. In "I send an email to my friend," the email is the direct object, and my friend is the indirect object, as they're the recipient of the email. Next, Salem bought his son a car. The car is the direct object, and his son is the indirect object, the recipient of the car. Finally, my father gave me a bicycle. The bicycle is the direct object, and I am the indirect object, receiving the bicycle. Now, if we look at the table, it summarizes these relationships clearly. Recognizing direct and indirect objects helps us understand how sentences are structured, especially when it comes to clarity in communication. This understanding is crucial as we continue to explore sentence construction and improve our language skills. Now let's talk about direct and indirect objects. A direct object is the thing that receives the action directly, like in the sentence, "I gave my keys to my mom." Here, my keys is the direct object because it's what I gave. The indirect object is who or what receives the benefit or is affected by the action, which in this case is my mom. When there is a to in the sentence, the indirect object usually comes after the direct object. For example, "My mother told a story to me." Here, a story is the direct object and me is the indirect object. It's important to note that with certain verbs, such as bring, confess, give, hand, lend, offer, pass, pay, promise, read, sell, send, show, take, tell, and write, you should use to when the indirect object is receiving something. So if you're constructing sentences with these verbs, remember to include to when indicating the indirect object. For example, "I handed the book to my friend," or "she promised to send the package to her sister." Understanding the placement of direct and indirect objects, especially with these particular verbs, will help make your sentences clearer and more correct. Let's take a closer look at how direct and indirect objects work together in a sentence. For example, in the sentence, "My mother cooked pizza for me," the pizza is what she cooked, so it's the direct object. The me is the one benefiting from the action, which makes it the indirect object. Now, a key point to remember is that if the sentence includes the word for, then the indirect object typically comes after the direct object. So, in the example, "My father bought a gift for me," the gift is the direct object, and me is the indirect object, indicating who the gift was for. When using certain verbs like book, build, buy, cook, find, get, keep, leave, make, order, and reserve, we often use for to show who is receiving the benefit or help. For instance, "She bought a cake for her friend" here. A cake is the direct object and her friend is the indirect object, and the for helps clarify that. So, to summarize, whenever you see for in a sentence, remember that the indirect object goes after the direct object. This structure helps clearly indicate who is benefiting from or receiving the action, especially with those helper verbs I just mentioned. Connecting this to the overall theme, understanding these parts helps us communicate more clearly and accurately in English. Now let's take a closer look at some examples involving direct objects and indirect objects. For instance, consider the sentence, "Sarah opens the door for me." Here, the door is the direct object and me is the indirect object. It's important to note that with some verbs, the preposition for cannot be omitted. Verbs like answer, cash, change, close, fix, open, prepare, pronounce, and translate always require the preposition for when indicating the indirect object. Let's look at another example. "My father brought me a gift." If we remove for, the sentence becomes, "My father bought a gift for me." Both versions are correct, but the placement of the indirect object changes the sentence structure. Similarly, consider, "My mother told me a story." If we omit to, it becomes, "My mother told a story to me." Again, both are correct, but the sentence flow varies depending on the structure. The key point here is understanding when to use the preposition for versus to, especially with certain verbs. Recognizing these patterns helps us communicate more clearly and accurately in English. This understanding is essential as we build more complex sentence structures throughout our learning journey. To understand the importance of this, we need to recognize how each element plays a role in the bigger picture. To start, the repeated use of to emphasizes direction and purpose, guiding us through the process. To me, it highlights the necessity of clear pathways and goals. Then, when we move to for, it signals the focus on the specific outcomes or benefits we're aiming for. For example, for often points to the target audience or the intended result, which is crucial for aligning our strategies. Overall, these words connect our actions to their purposes, reinforcing the idea that every step we take should be purpose-driven and aligned with our overarching objectives. This connection is what ultimately drives success in our efforts. Let's take a look at exercise E on page 255 of the workbook. This exercise is designed to reinforce what we've covered and help you apply the concepts practically. As you work through it, focus on understanding the key principles we've discussed. This will make the exercise more meaningful. Remember, the goal here is to connect theory with real-world application, so don't hesitate to think critically about each question. This is a great way to solidify your learning and see how these ideas come together in practice. Keep in mind the overall theme of this presentation, turning knowledge into actionable skills, and exercises like this are essential for that transformation. So approach it thoughtfully, and you'll get the most out of it.